Okay, we are picking up right where we left off with the ideas and politics and election of Andrew Jackson. So we're going to continue now with Jacksonian democracy. And what we're going to talk about for almost this entire lecture is Andrew Jackson. So when we left Andrew Jackson, he had lost a political election. And now, picking back up, we're going to talk about how he wins an election. And that election that he wins is going to be the election of 1828. If you remember, last time when we were talking about him losing an election, it was 4 years ago in 1824. He lost to John Quincy Adams of the North. And next time, 4 years later, when Quincy Adams is up for re-election, it's going to be a rematch between those two in 1828, Andrew Jackson versus the incumbent John Quincy Adams. So I want to talk now about some of the factors that helped Jackson win. He lost last time. How does he win this time? Well, a big part of it, a big reason what helps Jackson win is that plenty of Americans agreed with that corrupt bargain last time. They felt that it was corrupt, that Jackson's loss was him being cheated out of the presidency. He was very popular from that, from having campaigned on the fact that he should have been president last time. He's still coasting on his victories from the War of 1812. He's still considered cool. He's still a war hero. He's still revered for his masculine frontiersman background, his common man persona. But that corrupt bargain really gave him a lot of sympathy from Americans that John Quincy Adams had only really gotten into the presidency because of a corrupt bargain, and now it's Jackson's turn to take office. Henry Clay should not have made that deal with John Quincy Adams. That shouldn't have happened. Jackson deserves the presidency. So that does help make him a popular, sympathetic figure in many Americans' minds. They still like him for his war hero status. But he's Andrew Jackson is also helped this time around by a New York politician named Martin Van Buren. And Martin Van Buren ends up being kind of the first campaign manager. He works to embrace political parties. Before this, it was considered accepted, like people kind of realized that, yeah, there are political parties and people vote along those lines, but it was kind of like a well-known open secret. You weren't really supposed to embrace it because political parties were seen as dirty and bad. George Washington had begged people not to make political parties. They'd fallen into them anyway, but nobody had really been able to embrace it because they were trying to keep it low. Martin Van Buren says, we have these political parties. Let's just go with it. Let's just embrace it. Let's unite Democrats as Democrats. That's what Andrew Jackson runs as. Andrew Jackson is a Democrat, and Van Buren says, let's go with it. Let's have a coherent platform. Let's get other people to fall into this group. Let's really take this and run with it. And he does. He establishes party newspapers. He really helps vigorously campaign for Jackson. And he's very good at helping Andrew Jackson win. And both sides really do end up engaging in pretty vigorous campaigning. Jackson's campaign is a bit more vigorous than John Quincy Adams because Jackson has Van Buren helping him, and also because John Quincy Adams is of an older school of thought, which was it was very ungentlemanly to campaign. You were supposed to kind of let your experience and your politics and your what you've done speak for you, and it was kind of crass to self-promote. But Jackson has no such qualms, and neither does Van Buren, and it does help propel Jackson a little bit more forward. Although John Quincy Adams's supporters do try to, instead of build Quincy Adams up for this election, they try to just tear Jackson down. It's one of the very early smear campaigns that occur. Quincy Adams's supporters really go after Andrew Jackson. They kind of rail against his lack of formal education. They kind of paint him as a uneducated brute. They even go after Andrew Jackson's wife, Rachel. She was divorced before she married Andrew Jackson, and they just drag her reputation through the mud. They even kind of hint that maybe she wasn't really even divorced. Maybe she was kind of a bigamist, that she wasn't even legally married to Andrew Jackson. And there's a lot of mudslinging going on here, but the Jackson campaign is indeed more vigorous and just simply not above slinging mud either. There's one famous campaign quote that makes the rounds during this is that while Adams was kind of deriding Jackson for being a uneducated brute, the Jackson people kind of embraced that. They thought, "Hey, this the president. This politician is tough." One of their famous campaign phrases in Jackson's favor was "Vote for Jackson who can fight, not Adams who can write." So, take that, you little intellectual. And it's successful. Jackson is able to embrace all of these things. And in the election of 1828, he sweeps into office with 55% of the popular vote, which is pretty good. That's a decent majority. And he succeeds, and now Andrew Jackson is the president. First quiz question: what factors helped Andrew Jackson win the election of 1828? And now that Jackson is president, we enter the age of Jackson in American history. And it's called that because Jackson does so many things that really change American politics. He is the first one to really embrace political parties and campaigning, things that we are very used to now when it comes to politics. But some of his beliefs really change the way that people feel about government because Andrew Jackson really redefines what it means to be a voting citizen and who can participate in government. Andrew Jackson had a very strong belief about enfranchisement or the right to vote. He felt that he really wanted to see the common man enfranchised and feel involved in politics. He envisioned all white men as participating in politics, as voting, as being political beings, and that their interests should be highlighted and supported and valued. He wanted to see them prioritized because Andrew Jackson himself had been a poor, non-elite individual. He felt that politics in America was were getting too elite, to run by kind of wealthy, privileged, educated men, and he wanted to see the common man really embraced. And this is the first push for that. The age of Jackson is also known as the age of the common man, where there is more of a reverence for that demographic. He wanted politics and political rhetoric to be available to everyone, not just the literate, educated, high kind of ivory tower college type people. People like, Thomas Jefferson, very well written, writing the Declaration of Independence. He wanted even the poor farmers to be enfranchised and feel empowered about it. He was very, very big on being the president of the common man. And Jackson really does, he sees himself as the champion of the working class and farmers. He even opens the White House during his inauguration. He says, anybody can come in. I want to be the president of the common man. He invites them to come in and shake the president's hand because he's just that available. And it becomes a total chaotic mess. I'm sorry it's so pixelated, but it's a kind of dramatization of what happened because the story is that the White House was just besieged by people flooding in. They wanted to shake the president's hand. Story goes that Andrew Jackson was forced to jump out a back window and run away and escape because he was just totally overwhelmed by the amount of people coming through. For his own safety, they had to secret him out. Supposedly, the White House was trashed after this. It just turned into a big frat party. There were people spilling alcohol on the rugs, and it was just a total mess. But that was the spirit, though, of Jackson, is that he wanted people to feel that welcome and that on the same level with him, that they could come in and shake his hand and not feel intimidated by it. Jackson is also a strong believer. His beliefs regarding the federal government is that he felt it should be very non-interference with people's daily lives. A classic old anti-federalist view. Small government, non-interference, a land of farmers and agriculturalists, no big banks or anything like that. Very small, kind of yeah, anti-federalist beliefs like we talked about. His he also has some very what are currently now more contemporarily very controversial views regarding slavery and Native Americans. In Jackson's mindset, uh, he did not believe in ending slavery or freedom for Black Americans. He felt that the black population should either remain enslaved or if they were freed, they should be just completely removed from society. It was just not compatible with white society. He was more in favor of obviously keeping the enslaved population where it was because of how important it was to the cotton economy. But if he had to end it, he wanted to see the enslaved or now freed population return to Africa in a movement. We'll end up talking about this eventually. The idea of colonization, where you would return that population to Africa and set up colonies there to help them establish free societies. He has a kind of a similar belief for regarding Native Americans that they are kind of in the way of westward white expansion and that there's just no place for them in American society. They need to be removed for their own good or taken out of the path of American expansion. They're just there's no way to reconcile their beliefs with America's expansion technologically and geographically, and that they're just too primitive, too uncivilized to really ever be assimilated into American culture. So, next quiz question, what were some of President Jackson's beliefs regarding enfranchisement and the federal government? We'll just do the first two. And the other reason, the big thing with the enfranchisement and the era of the common man makes Jackson a very significant historical figure because of the way he shakes up politics. But he's also really significant because his rise to power really does lead to a reorganization of parties. They do kind of keep that old Federalist, anti-Federalist belief system, but they have a different flavor now during the 1820s, 30s, into the 1840s. Andrew Jackson runs as a Democrat, and the Democratic Party becomes a major American party. Democrats revolve their platform, they build their platform on a lot of those anti-federalist beliefs. But they're very heavily concerned with how the market revolution has changed society. They're concerned that about the common man. They're worried that all of this rapid industrialization and technology is at the expense of the poor farmer or, that real like kind of working class individual. Really wants to empower farmers and tradesmen and very skeptical of what Jackson called non-producers. People like bankers, bureaucrats, speculators, intellectuals, writers, things like that. People that didn't, grow their own food or make their own goods and felt that the market revolution had prioritized them and that things needed to be reversed, that the government should be all for the common man, the common farmer, and that the latter, the intellectuals and the bankers, should not be allowed to control the government because they would only use it to enrich themselves. The Democratic platform also very heavily involved in the idea that the government should keep its hands off the economy and that banks would only enhance inequality as well. The other major political party that forms at the time is going to be the Whig Party, WHIG is pictured here. And the Whigs emerge as basically the party of anti-Andrew Jackson. They think his ideas are dangerous and corrupting, and that he's just kind of a big, nasty brute. And the Whigs are very much the ones that still embrace the Federalist ideas, the idea that they want the economy to grow. They want merchants and bankers and a strong urban sector in the United States. They want to be competitive in the global economy, national banks and uh, a big thing that the Whigs believed in was something that they called the American system. The American system was the idea that the Whigs wanted to take government money. They wanted the federal government to pay for infrastructure, things like canals and railroads, things that would help the country grow and help grow the country's economy. This was very popular in the North and New England, something that kind of made that geographical region more in favor of this political party because that's where there was less agriculture and there was more business and things like canals and railroads would really benefit these businesses very heavily. Okay, next quiz question. What were some of the beliefs of the Whig Party? Now, some of the problems that Andrew Jackson faced while in office, one of them was something that would become known as the Tariff of Abominations. Andrew Jackson inherits this tariff that's in place from John Quincy Adams. And what this tariff was is something that Adams put in place to raise the price of goods that were imported from Europe. And it was something that the government applied to all of the states. However, it particularly applied to manufactured goods. So it was a tariff or a tax on things that came out of a factory. So, like things like spun fabric, uh, things like iron, anything like that, like factory made goods uh, were applicable to this tariff. So it made imported goods more expensive. And the goal of the tariff was to encourage people to trade domestically in the United States, to stop looking to Europe and England for their goods and to start looking to one another. However, this tariff will become very unpopular with the South. They're the southern states. In the South, they're the ones that give it the name the Tariff of Abominations. They are extremely angry with this because they feel that this tariff hurts them in particular. Yet this little cartoon here, the South is the guy here that's kind of starving and little, and the North is the one who is a little bit more robust and a bit better dressed and doing well. The South felt that this tariff hurt them because they don't have a lot of factories. They're not manufacturing a lot. They're very agricultural. So they have to import a lot of stuff. They're doing a lot of importation from Europe. They're the ones that end up paying very heavily for this tariff. The North has more factories. They don't have to import stuff. They can make it themselves. And now that there's a tariff on European goods, and those are more expensive, the South has to buy from the North. So the North is just benefiting all over from this. They have a new market in the South thanks to these tariffs, and and they can make stuff on their own if they need it. So their own economy is growing because they can make stuff for themselves and they're selling more stuff to the South. The North is growing rich and well off and slightly rotund as this little, I think this is a etching, yeah, as this shows. And they're just doing super well. And there is a sense that they're doing this at the expense of the South, and the South is not very happy with this. They're extremely concerned with this inequality, and they call it the Tariff of Abominations. The South is also really worried that this will hurt their relationship with the British. They've been selling a lot of cotton to the British, and now they can't afford to buy British goods. They're worried, uh-oh, what if now we've just lost this trade partner in the British? So the South is very, very concerned with this. Next quiz question. Why did the Tariff of Abominations anger the American South? The Tariff of Abominations leads to something that's known as the nullification crisis that happens in 1832. What happens is that South Carolina, feeling very targeted by this tariff, they are led by the vice president, John C. Calhoun, who was from South Carolina, and they're going to threaten to nullify the 1828 tariff because they feel that it is unfair. They want to declare it null and void in their state. This isn't benefiting us, this is hurting us. We are going to just simply not follow it. And not pay it either. That's kind of how they're going to oppose it. And this is going to start to lead to a lot of questions about, okay, we Jackson loves the idea of states' rights and states being um, more empowered than the federal government because you don't want one strong big federal government. There is a sense that you have to start questioning, okay, how much is too much rights for the states? Because if you let them do whatever they want, it's going to lead to total anarchy and chaos. You can't just have them erode federal authority by going off and doing whatever they want. So this puts Andrew Jackson in a very difficult position. He wants to maintain those anti-federalist democratic beliefs that the federal government should stay off and let states do what they want. But now you have this problem where they call it a crisis because they're afraid that South Carolina might just not do what it's told and possibly even secede or leave the Union. And there is a growing fear that that might happen. So Andrew Jackson is kind of between a rock and a hard place. Do I let South Carolina do whatever it wants and make me look weak and bad? And they might even possibly just leave the Union. They might not even be a state anymore. They might just strike out on their own. South Carolina as its own country. Wow. Or do I kind of bring the hammer down and make myself look like a real tyrant and tell them, no, you have to pay this tariff and you have to stay in the Union. And Andrew Jackson kind of ends up having to go with the latter. He passes the Force Act, which gives him permission to use the military to collect the tariff that South Carolina was refusing to pay. He sees this as a threat to national unity, and in Jackson's mind, this takes precedence over states' rights. And again, it was called a crisis because there was a real fear that South Carolina would secede or leave over this. And it was a real moment where you could start to see these regional tensions coming into play, these tensions over the government versus states. We'll get more into this more heavily when we start talking about the Civil War. Okay, next question. What was the nullification crisis? So that's one issue that another issue Jackson faced. Another one was the topic of Indian removal, because as I mentioned earlier, Jackson did not feel that Native Americans were compatible with American life and that the best thing for them and for Americans was to remove them elsewhere from where they were kind of blocking progress. Let's see if I can move my own my own floating head video out of the way so I can see this map better. One of the things that Andrew Jackson did was fund, give states money to fund the relocation of Native Americans to unsettled territory west of the Mississippi and get them out of the path of frontiers people moving out west. So you can see here these darker green squares show where there were several different indigenous groups that were then moved further west. And the idea was really that to get them out of the way, that all of this fertile territory was very heavily desired by American settlers. It was very fertile, good land for growing cotton. So people really wanted to settle there. And you can't settle with Native Americans. The idea was to just move them and free up this land for Americans. And Andrew Jackson kind of settles this in his own mind with the idea that he's doing it for the good of the Native Americans as well. Like he's doing this in their best interest, that he feels he can't stop settlers from moving west and killing them or destroying their way of life. So he's going to just pick them up and move them elsewhere so that they can kind of lead their lives uninterrupted, especially because he just didn't feel they would ever assimilate into American society. Often referred to them as savages, that they were too uncivilized and would simply never be able to integrate themselves into society. And he felt that Americans just would not be able to leave them alone. They would want their land too much. They would just pressure them right off of the land. So this was the solution that Jackson came up with and helped fund, was the idea that you would remove the Native American populations and kind of put them in what's now present day Oklahoma. Okay, next question. What was the goal of Indian removal? The Indian Removal Act. Act was passed in 1830 to kind of make this official, that policy of funded removal by the federal government. Okay, so there were some different native responses to Indian removal. In 1832, the Black Hawk War erupted in the area of present-day Illinois and Michigan, and this was kind of a more militant response to Indian removal, where you had groups like the Sauk, it's spelled down there, Sauk, like the Sauk that actually physically fought back. They fought wars against the incursions of the government trying to push them off of the land. Called the Black Hawk War after the Sauk leader Black Hawk. Black Hawk led a group of 1,000 of his followers into that area to attempt to resettle after they'd already been pushed back off of the land. But this war between Black Hawk and the Americans was the American militias came out. They were the um, followers of Black Hawk were forced to surrender. But it does show that there was a militant response to it. Another response was a attempt to fight back against Indian removal through legal means, through legal channels. And this was the most famous was the Cherokee, who attempted to claim that the Indian removal was illegal because it was states doing it, and states should not have the right to do that because Native Americans were supposed to be considered foreign countries within the United States, and only the federal United States government had the right to do anything with them to make alliances because that's how the Constitution works. You have a um you have this idea that only the federal government can make alliances or deal with foreign countries. The Sauk were a foreign country. They were not Americans. They're in America, but they're not American citizens. It should just be the federal government. Same with the Cherokee. If they're not being protected as Americans, they have to be dealt with as members of a foreign country. And that's what the argument was in Worcester v. Georgia. They bring it up to the courts and argue that the state of Georgia did not have the jurisdiction to start pushing the Cherokee off of the land because only the federal government could do that. And the result of the case Worcester v. Georgia was that it was actually ruled in favor of the Cherokee that, yeah, okay, what Georgia is doing is in violation of the law because the Cherokee had treaties they'd made with the federal government to be able to stay in their land, but it's almost totally unenforceable. The Indian Removal Act gives enough power to states to do this, and it also is just it's kind of a popular thing. People want that land. There's not enough of support for allowing indigenous groups to stay on their land that anybody's going to really enforce it. Even though Worcester v. Georgia is decided in the Cherokee's favor, there's no one that's going to uphold that, and it has no teeth. They're removed regardless, even though legally they did have a solid case that um, they should have been able to remain there. They'd hoped the Cherokee had really hoped that by attempting to go through legal channels would show that they understood the United States government and its policies, that they were very civilized and educated, and were trying to go about this um, in a more formal way, unlike fighting a war like the Black Hawk War. However, it was unsuccessful. There's just too much of a demand for that fertile land in the South that the Cherokee had occupied. Okay, next quiz question. What was the result of Worcester v. Georgia? And part of Indian removal was an event known as the Trail of Tears. This occurred during the winter of 1838 to 1839, when about 18,000 Native Americans who lived in the South were removed to present-day Oklahoma. The Trail of Tears is the name given to the various paths that they were forced to walk to leave where they had been, sometimes their ancestral homelands, to the new territory designated for them in Oklahoma. And it's called the Trail of Tears for pretty obvious reasons. Many of them are absolutely devastated to be forced off of their land. They did not want to leave, but also it's called this because of all the suffering that they endure throughout the way. I mean, they're herded together by the army comes in. They're marched by force out to Oklahoma. It's the land, the terrain is rough. The climate is pretty brutal. It's the winter, so plenty people freeze to death. They're starving. They start dying of disease. It takes a very long time to get there. It's extremely harsh. The soldiers are not very kind to them as they're marching them out there. A lot of people die. And when they do get to Oklahoma, they find, well, Oklahoma. It's not as lush and nice and what they were used to. And it does change their life anyway. Part of the justification of doing this was that, their way of life will be destroyed if American settlers crush them. But by moving them to a totally different terrain, they're going to have to change their ways to adapt to that anyway. So it is definitely kind of a stain on the United States government and military that this had happened. Some of there were a couple water routes, some river routes here, but they're shown here. There's pretty well documented cases of where the Trail of Tears went. You can see there's maps of it and historic trails. I believe it can still be walked or it can still be traveled in some way to kind of pay respect to those were forced to walk it back in the late 1830s. Next quiz question. What was the Trail of Tears? So now we're going to get back to politics and talk about some more elections. So despite, or perhaps in because of things like Indian removal, plenty of Americans agreed with it that they wanted access to that land. Um, this Andrew Jackson was very popular. He remained popular throughout his presidency. His supporters were very ardent of his superiority. And he does win re-election in 1832. And this time he runs with vice president, no more Calhoun. That was pretty bad. His own vice president tried to leave the Union. His vice president was Martin Van Buren for a while, his buddy who helped him win in the first place. Jackson runs with Martin Van Buren as his vice president. They win. Jackson gets a second term. So a lot of those policies continue, things we talked about. And then in 1837, Martin Van Buren, who had been Jackson's vice president, he runs for president himself, and he's successful. And Martin Van Buren is elected to office as president in 1837. So the presidents go from two terms of Jackson to Martin Van Buren. But Martin Van Buren was not very popular as a president. A lot of people felt he'd kind of ridden in on the coattails of Andrew Jackson because he was such good buddies with him. And Van Buren never had the same charisma that Jackson did. He's not very bombastic. He is not a war hero. Ooh, bad, very bad. Doesn't have the same pull as Jackson. He's a New Yorker, so he's from the North. Van Buren is seen as very aristocratic, very well read, which is for some reason looked down upon. Um, and his opponents, Van Buren's opponents, painted him as a very lavish spender. Martin Van Buren had it in his head that the White House needed to be really well appointed. Like it had to have silver tea sets and all sorts of stuff to impress visiting dignitaries, that it needed to be classy. And he did spend a lot of money making the White House look good. But his opponents saw him as a wasteful spender and just too, you know, very deep pockets, very un-American, very anti-Andrew Jackson. And the country was in the midst of an economic depression at the time. Americans were starting to look for a change in leadership. So a lot of those factors came together, and Martin Van Buren does not win a second term. He loses his re-election campaign in 1840 to William Henry Harrison, who's pictured here. Part of the reason why William Henry Harrison is considered the better candidate is because he is, guess what? He's a war hero. He was in the War of 1812, if you remember that one. And he is very much more like Andrew Jackson. He has that common man background. He is also a Whig, Whig. That should make you confused. If it did, you're correct. The Whigs were supposed to be the anti-Andrew Jackson party, remember? Well, they changed their tune this time around. The Whigs are the ones, you have Martin Van Buren, he's a Democrat. He is very aristocratic. So the Whigs feel like, ooh, that made him unpopular. We're going to jump on that train of the common man, the whiskey drinking frontiersman. They really paint William Henry Harrison as the common man, and they abscond with that idea of their party as being the one of the common man because it worked so good for Jackson. Van Buren just couldn't fit that mold. So they really take that upon themselves. They pick that up and they make themselves now the Whigs as the party of the common man, and it helps William Henry Harrison get into office on that platform. Okay, next quiz question. Why did Martin Van Buren lose re-election in 1840? William Henry Harrison does not last very long in office. In fact, William Henry Harrison is the shortest serving president ever. He ends up dying pretty soon after. I think the story is that he gave like a very long inauguration speech and dies about 2 months later. So he, his first term is served out by his vice president, John Tyler. John Tyler was, as I said, he was William Henry Harrison's vice president, but he holds basically the exact opposite views of Harrison. Tyler was only stuck there in the vice president's position because they were hoping to just expand the pool of voters by having someone with a different point of view there. They're thinking, well, we'll catch everybody. If they don't like Harrison, they'll like Tyler because we've got two opposite viewpoints. We can't lose. Haha, what a great idea. They also thought there was no way on this green earth that Tyler would ever get the presidency. They figured he would just kind of be there as a figurehead. The vice president really hadn't done that much lately. It was just kind of just there. They thought they'd attract more voters, make their party seem very diverse. Oops, Harrison dies of pneumonia after 1 month in office, and his accidency, what a nice nickname, ends up becoming the president. And John Tyler is not a popular president. He is kind of not popular because people didn't even really know him. They're like, who is this? Who is this accident in the executive in the executive seat now, his accidency. He also gets a much less appealing nickname. He becomes known as the executive ass because he is considered that much of an ass that they make it official and start calling him that. So why is John Tyler the executive ass? Well, he is a Whig in name only, really. He has these opposite views to the party that helped elect him. He was there to diversify the seat, but now he's in charge and he's going to stick to his views, which are opposite to the party currently seated. Um, he doesn't share enough views with those around him, and nothing is ever really accomplished by the Whig Party because of Tyler being seated in office, where everybody around him says one thing and he says the other. Those opposite views that he held leads to a lot of political deadlock in the White House, and nothing is really accomplished. It's seen as something that really costs the Whig Party their respectability because they have this person who's a Whig but doesn't agree with anything that they're saying. You know, he does not share their belief in tariffs or their beliefs in a national bank. He is not very helpful. He's considered kind of a difficult person to get along with, and he is going to cause a lot of challenges for that party and start to make people think that, well, maybe we should go with the opposite party now. So he does cost the Whig Party a lot of their respectability, and it's going to be difficult for them to recover from that. They lost William Henry Harrison very unexpectedly, and then they're going to be faced with this very intractable type of individual who is just not going to help further their beliefs or help them achieve anything while he's in office. He's an actual impediment to all of the goals that the Whigs had. So you could forgive them, I suppose, for calling their own executive the ass. All right. Final quiz question for you here. Why was John Tyler considered an executive ass? All right. So next time we get together, next lecture here, we're going to go back into the idea of themes, thematic topics, and we're going to cover the growth and expansion of slavery in the South because what we're starting to do now, what we've been starting to do now, is we are in the vein of trying to start explaining the origins of the American Civil War, and that's going to be really the goal and the topic of the remainder of this course.